Hello, my name is Owen, and welcome to a review of Brandon Sanderson's Wind and Truth, where we're going to answer the question, is Wind and Truth good? This is book 5 of the Stormlight Archive, end of the first arc of the Stormlight Archive. A very much anticipated book, long awaited, and we're going to talk about it, okay? And just as a warning to you, there will be soft spoilers in this book. I recommend if you haven't read the book, you haven't finished the book yet, just scram, okay? Because I'm going to be unfettered in this review. I don't plan on talking specifics with you about like plot, but I might do broad strokes plot stuff if it's relevant to my criticisms or praise. But I just recommend like read the book, come back here, and then we'll talk about it, okay? And jumping into it, for those of you that don't know, I did a reread of Stormlight in the last few months leading up to this, and let me just say, like, I'm a genius. It's one of the smartest things I ever did, because I think a lot of plot points that are important in this book are like not what I thought was important when I was thinking about the series before I did my reread, if that makes sense. Because, you know, like remembering the series before I reread it, it's like broad stroke stuff. It's Kaladin and Dalinar and them taking oaths and they're powering up, they're gonna fight Odium, right? But stuff like the Unmade and like the contest and the god lore and stuff like that, which are important in this book, it's just not at the forefront of my mind. So I feel like I would have gotten a little bit of whiplash just jumping into this book. Not that it's like super obscure stuff that he dives into, but it's just like, it's been a couple of years since I read the series, right? So it was good to get a refresher. Overall, very glad I did that reread. Luckily, I didn't get burnt out on Stormlight leading up to this. I feel like, while I had criticisms of it, I wasn't like tired of the world. I wasn't tired of the characters reading Wind and Truth, which is a good thing. That being said, because I reread them all recently, it brings up some unique perspectives on the series, I think, which I'm going to talk about. But overall, and I really haven't read other people's reviews of it. I haven't watched anybody else's reviews. I've seen some headlines. I think people are mostly positive on it, which is a good thing. I like when people enjoy things. But I have I don't want to say love-hate relationship. I think that's too aggressive. I think I have a like-dislike relationship with this book. And I don't know if I lean more towards positive or negative. I kind of wavered. I think... And let's just talk about why I think this. So first of all, one of my main criticisms for most of the books was pacing. I had pacing issues with almost all of these books, except maybe Way of Kings. And this is a behemoth book, 1,400 pages, and there's a lot going on. Now, don't get me wrong. There's going to be a lot of don't get me wrongs in this review, but don't get me wrong. It's a long book, and there's a lot going on. And I'm not advocating for like a Game of Thrones situation where like, oh, maybe he does like Wind and Truth and it's like these POVs and then like there's like Truth and Wind and it's the rest of the POVs. Like separating, like if this was like a 2,000 page book and he just separated into 1,000 page books, that is meaningless to me. If he wants to release a 4,000 page book, whatever, he can do what he wants. I just think that, there was too much going on, and I think, again, this could have been shorter, and I think you could have cut some plot lines entirely, or maybe just structured it in a way that's different. And it's something I've said before where there's not a lot of moments in Stormlight where I'm like, that could have been cut entirely, because it's all important to the plot. But what I'm saying is he should have restructured the story so that these plot lines shouldn't have been important, or they weren't needed in some ways, because he doesn't get a lot of payoff for these things. But let's just say what I'm talking about. For most of these books, the majority of these stories, barring a few exceptions, we follow 3 settings, essentially. Usually it's Kaladin, Shallan, and Dalinar. They're each in their own area. They each got their own plot line, and like the other POVs kind of splinter off from there, right? Like, for example, Way of Kings, Kaladin was a slave in the Shattered Plains, or Dalinar was also in the Shattered Plains, but he had his own camp. They didn't really interact. Shallan was on her own journey, right? Rhythm of War. Dalinar was at war. Kaladin was trapped in the Radiant City without powers, and Navani was kind of in that storyline too, same setting. They were both being taken over, and then Shallan was in the realm of the Spren, right? I can't remember the name off the top of my head, because now I'm thinking spiritual realm, and it's not the spiritual realm, it's the other realm, right? And then those storylines spin off from there. All the other characters, like, they're attached to one of those plot lines, and they kind of, like, Yasna was Dalinar in Rhythm of War. Adolin was with Shallan in the Spren world. In this book, let's count, shall we? Kaladin and Sazeth were in Shinovar. We had Dalinar and Navani in the spiritual realm. Shallan was also in the spiritual realm, but there was a little bit of overlap, but not a lot of overlap. We'll count that as a half, right? So that's flashbacks, which will count as a half to Kaladin's storyline because they're in the same place. Even though it's not directly relevant, it's thematically relevant to what happens there. So let's just make that 3, right? Then we have Adolin in Azir. Then we have Yasna in Thaylen. And then we have Venli's storyline in the Shattered Plains, wherever she is. And then there's the Battle of the Shattered Plains. But I guess maybe Venli eventually crosses over there. So let's just say 6. But realistically, it's more like 7 and a half. Right, of settings and storylines that we're following here. It's a lot going on. And the problem, and like I said, they're all relevant, they all pay off, they're all important to his world building and stuff. The thing that bothered me, first of all, is sometimes what they pay off to. There's a lot of storylines, and I had the same problem with the interludes in the previous books. And this book is structured slightly differently with like the days format rather than just like the part 1, part 2, part 3 or whatever. Some of them, and this is a minimal thing, this doesn't happen too often, but there's a lot of scenes, there's a lot of character interactions that are clearly, the payoff is the wider Cosmere. And I've said this before with Sanderson's book, I don't know if I'm bought into the Cosmere. I think what he does with world building, especially in this book, is incredibly interesting, and it piques my interest. There's moments where I read a part of lore about the gods, or like the breaking up of the gods, or like the travel between the planets, where I'm like, oh, like I kind of want to read every Cosmere book to see how this happens, or see what characters and what they do in this world, which is exactly what he wants, right? And I'm like, this is super interesting. And there's other parts where I'm reading a Stormlight book, and this is clearly a scene setting up, it's like a post-credit scene in Marvel where it's clearly setting up a team-up of some kind in a book that I don't even know which book it'll be in, which is frustrating in the conclusion of an arc. And we'll talk about the conclusion of arc thing if I remember it. Let's just talk about it now, okay? I have seen some criticisms where like, oh, like Sanderson betrayed us. Not betrayed, but maybe he misled us a little bit where he said like this was the conclusion of an arc. There will be a second arc, but it's kind of like a time jump or whatever. It's kind of a different story, maybe following some different characters. I think for the most part, I understood like what he promised is like the end of an arc. I can see that in this book. I didn't feel like I was misled into how much of a conclusion it was. I feel like some people are saying that it's not enough of a conclusion. I see why they're saying that. I felt like it was enough of a conclusion. You couldn't stop here, but I never felt like I was supposed to be able to stop here. But there are some conclusions to specific characters and storylines, enough characters and storylines where I felt like it was an end of an arc, right? And I feel like if I wanted to, I could walk away being fine with not knowing how it plays out because there's enough of a conclusion with some of the characters that I cared about, if that makes sense. But kind of backtracking, what was I talking about? Yeah, so some of these stories are just like hinting at further Cosmere stories, which kind of takes away, I think, from the storm lightiness that I cared about. Because I just go back and forth whether or not I care about the wider universe. What I don't like, though, is when it takes away from our immediate story. It just feels like fluff to me. It's like if Marvel put post-credit scenes but like interspersed them edited inside the movie, it would mess with the pacing a little bit, which is why Marvel doesn't do that. Sometimes they do like little Easter eggs, but they're not doing like Harry Styles enters the movie of Eternals in like the second act. Because you'd be like, what is this about? Is this going to be relevant? And then it's not relevant for the rest of the book because it's clearly like hinting at something that'll happen in the future. It messes with the pacing. And the other problem with the pacing of this book is because we have 7 different storylines, 7 different settings in a 1,400-page book separated by this day structure, like day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, up to day 10, he has to check in with them every single day. And then the way he does that is like we're constantly, I think he does it pretty time concurrently. So he's checking in every moment of the day. He's checking with each storyline in a row. So most of these like POV switches are only like 3 pages long, which I found extraordinarily frustrating. And this was the thing I'm most upset about. Let me make that very clear. I was sometimes enraged by the structure of this book because Sanderson's like bread and butter is when he does POV switches to keep you engaged, he ends it on a cliffhanger. And the POV switches, you're like, I want to see what happens. And then that POV becomes the most interesting one. And then it switches over. And that's what he does. And he attempts to do that in this book, but it just felt like stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. Because every POV was 3 pages long. You never really got your teeth sunk into any of these POVs, which I think overall made all of them less interesting. Because there's interesting things that happen with Shallan's storyline. However, the way that it was structured, I never really got fully invested in it. And I thought that her entire storyline was not satisfying to me in the slightest. And I think that like if you just like in a normal Stormlight book, you gave her some bigger time, you put it all together. Yeah, her fighting the ghost blood, she's in the spiritual realm, blah, 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 blah. There is some like wider Cosmere stuff that I just don't care about that they're hinting at. But for the most part, I think if you put it all together, it is a more interesting storyline. But the way that it was cut up, like it was filler. Unfortunately, it felt like filler to me, and I was frustrated by that. Renarin and Relane's storyline with her as well, very, very thematically important, very, very plot important, but you don't like care until the last scene that they were building up to, and it became very obvious at the beginning of their POV what it was going to end like. So every time you're checking in with them, it was just filler. It was just filler writing, and Venli's storyline completely useless, completely filler, all for the payoff at the very end. So a lot of these storylines, they were just like it felt like they were vamping the whole time until there was the one important scene. And Shallan in Stormlight should not be a filler character. And yet her storyline felt like it was to me. And like I said, it's not that I think that everything that happens early, like it was useless until the end. It was just the way that it was structured. I wasn't invested. And then the important thing happened. You're like, okay, that's clearly why he did that scene. That's why he wrote this storyline. But I was never invested in the build up to that, which is the majority of the book. Because if you have 7 POVs, they're not all split equally, 1,400 pages. That's around 200 pages per POV if they're split equally. Obviously, Kaladin and Sazeth get a heavy amount of page time. Dalinar gets a lot of page time. But it's just like, I feel like it would have been better off if we were just left up to our imagination of what was happening at the Shattered Plains. Or what was happening with Venli. Or maybe restructure it so like those are like, I don't know, more connected, but like less page time. I don't know. It just felt badly structured. Not just like, oh, it's a little long. It felt badly structured. It messed with the flow almost the entirety of the book. And then, I don't know. Like, there were the storylines that I liked. Let's talk about the positives for a little bit. Adolin's storyline I liked until the end, I think, for the most part. I think, like, when he was in charge, I liked that part. It felt tense. It felt grounded. He gets injured. It really takes a slowdown. And then at the end, he has this, like, cool moment with, like, the unoath. Interesting concept. I wouldn't say I was interested in his storyline by that point, though. And that's the problem with Sanderson. That's how he gets his hooks into you. Something really cool happens. You're like, he's the greatest writer, but then you forget that, like, leading up to that, you were bored for, like, 400 pages. But I think overall his storyline was positive. Sazeth and Kaladin's journey was interesting. Sazeth's flashbacks were good. And regarding Shallan and Dalinar in the spiritual realm, I think it was a bold choice to lock them into a vague world we've never visited before for almost the entirety of the book. And as much as I liked time travel, and I liked him being able to visit these important part of histories, it felt like the spiritual realm was just like a very convenient plot device. And most of the time it brought us cool moments, let us see the heralds, let's give some god lore. But also at times, like, I was very aware of how convenient it was. How convenient it was taking them these specific moments. How convenient it let them learn certain things. It was a plot device, first of all. I think it was a well-done plot device, but it was a plot device. And I was very cognizant of that. And then, yeah, Shattered Plain stuff. Sigil, not a favorite character of mine. He's a background character. Let's try to not make him a main character. I know he's a main character in the Sunlit Man. I understand that. I don't care about him, though. Waste of my time. Thaylen City, waste of Yasmin's character. Waste of her character, honestly. And it felt silly that was even a plot even considered. But the fact that, like, Dalinar, Navani, Shallan were locked in this realm the whole time, I think it put a hamper on the plot. And I wasn't fully bought into it. But, like I said, I did like the lore of the heralds and the gods and stuff like that. It is interesting. It is thought-provoking. I could see what he's trying to do with the Cosmere. It does spark my interest a little bit. But then it made me think, like, at the end of the day, like, reading Wind and Truth, the conclusion I came to finishing it, I think it was a good ending, by the way. I did like the ending. My biggest problem with Stormlight, with Wind and Truth specifically, I think overall I can say that I liked the book. It had enough good moments that it kept me through. I've just decided that this is not a series that is changing my life. I think the jokes are more forced, or they felt more forced to me in this book. I think the deep lines felt more forced in this book. I felt like he was trying to do too many iconic lines, too many deep moments. Not to say that they were bad, or that they didn't make sense, or they didn't work thematically, or that they weren't like good lines, because a lot of them were. All of them felt forced though. Or maybe I was just aware of that he was trying to say something very important. Like, and the way he writes his writing too, it's like very like short line, the important line. And he'll italicize it, or he'll bold it, or he'll capital letters italicize it. You know, this is the important part. I get it's important. And I get that you think that's important. And maybe it is important, but sometimes it's not. And every time it's not, you lose a point from me. Okay? Just saying. The jokes were more forced. The deepness was more forced. But more importantly, the scale of this book is not the reason that I fell in love with Stormlight. I think is my biggest problem with the book. Because if you think about Way of Kings, you think about like Kaladin fighting every day in the bridge cruise, right? And by the way, I think his character arc is well done in this book. I think like his build up with his journey leading up to who he is in Wind and Truth is great. But it's grounded there. Dalinar's fighting a battle. He's trying to be a leader. Shalana is like learning her powers or whatever. In this book, it's almost entirely about gods. It's almost entirely about the Cosmere and the planets and the gods moving from planets to planets. So we started changing from talking about slave and bridge crews and generals and students and learning and a little bit of magic, right? To honor being a character, like a real character, and these gods clashing and the rules of the gods and the different planets that they come from. Like using words like planets, it's like something you would never consider reading Way of Kings. And it's about characters coming in from other worlds. They're using powers. They're trying to consolidate their power. They're taking over entire continents in a single day. Like there's different battles in different continents, different cities. The scale has just gotten so massive, and it's not bad. It's not bad writing. It's just completely different than what I bought into with the series, if that makes sense. I just think I had to mentally adjust myself that like this is not going to be a life-changing series for me. And the scale of the series has changed. I don't think you can go back to the grounded Stormlight, where like the Stormlight makes him stronger and it makes him heal. Now it's people are flying around, they're shooting portals, they're going into realm to realm, they're time traveling through visions. That's just the world that we live in now. And things grow and things change, and it's just evolved into a series that I think, in my opinion, is marginally less interesting, unfortunately. But like I said, overall, I felt like it was a good book. And there was enough moments that I enjoyed to like, I'm probably going to check out Stormlight 6. But I just like, my perception of the series as a whole has changed after reading this book. For the worse, I think. Because even my other favorite, Rhythm of War, still felt very grounded. It felt like almost a return to form. Maybe that's why I liked it so much. Where Kaladin was out without his powers. He was just simply trying to save the tower. That's all he was trying to do. Dalinar was like negotiating with Odium, but he was like fighting a battle at the same time. This one, it just felt so huge. It felt so massive. It felt so huge, massive in scale, I guess, that like it kind of, I don't know, I think it loses sight a little bit of what the series was originally about. And that's why I'm so conflicted about it, because like I said, it sounds like I'm being really negative about it. It sounds like I'm really putting it down. I think it was a good conclusion. I think the character arcs that end here are very, very strong. I just think I'm less interested in where the series has gone and is going than I was when I started the journey, if that makes sense. And I think if I had to walk away from it now, I think I could do so. But like I said, I think Brandon Sanderson is probably one of the best writers in terms of like world building. I think the entire concept of these gods is very interesting, but I didn't buy into this series because of the battle of the gods. And it's very clear that like Roshar and Stormlight will be like the playing field for this storyline that he has with the Cosmere. It's just not, while it is interesting, it's not the thing that I find most interesting about this series. But that's overall my thoughts. I think I could talk a lot more in depth about like specifics. I don't know if I am going to. I think it's a good book. I will say that the structure of it is bad, though. I hate this style of writing. I hate the 3-page switch. It's exhausting. It is exhausting to me. But what happens in the pages itself, objectively, was good to me. Okay? What a long journey I've been on with this series. 7,000 pages-ish of Stormlight. And it was a good ride. It was a good ride. Please let me know what you guys think about this. I feel like people will think I'm a little bit too harsh on this book. But I hope that my criticism makes sense. And I hope you understand that, like, I don't hate this story. I don't. I just like it less than I did when I started it. But be sure to like and subscribe if you like the video and you want to see more like in the future. And as always, thanks for sticking around.